The night I found out, I was fixing a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. I remember this detail with strange precision. The cold of the tile floor through my jeans, the smell of old water and rust, the particular frustration of a wrench that kept slipping on a corroded fitting. It was an ordinary Tuesday in late November, and Sera was upstairs in the study with the door closed, which was where she was most evenings now, and I was on my back under the sink thinking about nothing more significant than whether we needed a plumber or whether I could manage this myself. Our son, Theo, was asleep. He was 9, and he slept the way only children sleep, completely, without reservation, as if unconsciousness were the most natural thing in the world. I envied him this. I had not been sleeping well for months. The pipe held. I tightened the fitting, ran the tap, watched for drips, found none. I lay there for a moment longer than necessary, looking up at the underside of the sink cabinet, the old wood, the watermarks, the small imperfections of a house that had been lived in for 8 years. Then I got up, washed my hands, and decided to take Sera a cup of tea. This is the part that matters. This is the part one come back to. I made the tea. I carried it upstairs. I knocked on the study door, one knock, the way I always knocked, low and quick, and I pushed it open. Sera was at her desk. Her laptop was open. She was typing, or had been typing, because at the sound of the door she closed the laptop with a single smooth motion, the way you close something you don't want seen. It was fast, practiced, the kind of speed that doesn't come from one occasion. She looked up at me. She smiled. "Hey," she said. "Is that tea?" "Yeah," I said. I set it down on the desk beside the closed laptop. I looked at her. She looked at me. The smile held, warm and familiar and entirely normal. "Thanks," she said. "I was just finishing up." I went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My name is Adam Voss. I am 43 years old. I am an architect. I design things for a living, which means I think spatially, structurally, in terms of what supports what and what happens when a load-bearing element is compromised. I have been told I am methodical, sometimes to a fault. My wife, Sera, used to call it my best quality when we were young and my most infuriating quality when we were less so. We had been married for 12 years. We'd met at a friend's birthday, both of us 29, and certain we knew exactly what kind of life we wanted. She was a freelance copywriter, smart, verbal, quick-witted in a way I had always found slightly dazzling. We bought the house in our second year together. Theo arrived 3 years after the wedding, late but unhurried, as if he too had consulted a plan before committing. For most of those 12 years, I had considered our marriage one of the reliable structures of my life. Not perfect, no honest structure is. We had had our difficult seasons, but reliable, load-bearing. That Tuesday night at the kitchen table, I sat with the image of Sera closing the laptop, and I asked myself a question I had been circling for months without landing on it directly. What is she hiding? Not from paranoia, not from jealousy, from the same instinct that tells me, when I look at a building someone else designed, whether the thing will hold. I thought it would hold. I was not yet sure. The opening image, Adam flat on his back under a sink, fixing something broken, is the story's first and most resonant metaphor. He is a man who repairs things, who finds problems and solves them methodically, who trusts the integrity of structures he has inspected. The laptop closing is a small action with enormous psychological weight. It is the moment his body registers what his mind has not yet articulated. His profession is deeply relevant here. Architects are trained to read negative space. The absence of a wall tells them as much as its presence. That same perceptual habit, turned on his marriage, begins assembling a picture from what is not said, not shown, not left open. His decision to go back downstairs rather than ask what she was doing is not passivity. It is the instinct of a precise man who knows that a premature question, asked before the evidence is sufficient, gives the other person the advantage. He is already, without knowing it, beginning to build a case. Let me tell you what our life looked like from the outside that autumn, because I think it matters. We were, by most measures, fine. The house was warm and well kept. Theo was thriving at school, curious, sociable, already obsessed with maps and trains in a way that made me quietly proud. Sera and I ate dinner together most nights, talked about the day, argued occasionally about small things, whose turn it was to call the boiler service, whether Theo needed new trainers. We watched television on Friday evenings. We went to her parents for Sunday lunch twice a month. We were, I would have said without hesitation in September, a functioning family moving through an ordinary autumn. But there were things I had filed without examining. Sera had always worked in the evenings. Freelance copywriting involves deadlines that don't respect the 9 to 5, and working after Theo went to bed had been a habit of hers for years. I had never thought to question it. It was part of the architecture of our routine, as structural and unremarkable as the load-bearing walls of our house. What had changed, and I dated this, later, to roughly July or August, was the quality of her evening work. Not the frequency, not the hours, the quality of her presence when she came back from it. Before, she would come downstairs after an evening at her desk looking the way a person looks after 2 hours of focused writing, slightly glazed, a little deflated, carrying the particular tiredness of sustained concentration. She would make tea, sit with me for 20 minutes, tell me about whatever she'd been working on. We had a rhythm. After July, after whatever it was that had changed, she came downstairs differently. Alert, slightly lit up, in a way that had nothing to do with the completion of a copywriting brief. There was a charge to her that I recognized. I had seen it in her years ago, when we were new, when everything was still discovery. I had told myself, in the early weeks, that this was simply a good patch. Energy returning. The natural variation of a person's interior weather. I was wrong, but I wasn't ready to be right yet. The first concrete anomaly was her phone. Sera had always been, like many people of our generation, moderately attached to her phone, checking it with the reflexive frequency of someone who grew up alongside the technology. Nothing unusual, but in September I noticed that she had changed her screen lock. We had never shared passwords. We were not that kind of couple, not from distrust, but from a mutual respect for privacy that had always felt healthy. But I knew, from years of casual observation, that her passcode had been Theo's birthday. I knew this the way you know unremarkable things about a person you live with, without ever having been told, simply from proximity. In September, the passcode changed. I discovered this accidentally, reaching for her phone to check a restaurant address when mine was charging. The code I reflexively entered didn't work. She was in the other room. I put the phone down and said nothing. I noted it. I moved on. In October, a client dinner. Sera had occasional in-person meetings with clients. Not often, perhaps once every 6 or 8 weeks. She mentioned one on a Wednesday morning. A client in the city, drinks and dinner to discuss a rebranding project. She'd be home by 10. She came home at 11:40. Not dramatically late. Late enough to be mildly unusual, not late enough to justify an accusation. She was slightly flushed, slightly bright, and she smelled of wine and cold air and something else I couldn't identify. She was warm and chatty and kissed me properly, and I thought, nothing is wrong. You are looking for things that are not there. But the next morning, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't look at it. I was determined not to look at it. But I saw, in the half-second before the screen dimmed, the banner of a notification. Not a name. An initial. R. One letter. Gone before I could think about it. I lay in bed and listened to the shower running and thought about nothing at all, very carefully. The third thing, the one that I kept returning to, was what Theo said one Saturday morning in late October. He was at the kitchen table, eating cereal, reading a book. I was making coffee. Sera was still upstairs. Out of nowhere, without looking up from his book, Theo said, "Dad, who is Remy?" I turned from the coffee machine. "Sorry, Remy," he said. Mom was talking to someone called Remy on her laptop. When I went to ask her something, she closed it really fast. He looked up, curious rather than concerned. She said it was a client. "Is Remy a client name?" "Could be," I said. He went back to his book. He was 9. The question had already left him. It stayed with me for weeks. The contrast between the marriage Adam believed he was living and the one beginning to reveal itself is sharpest in Theo's question. A 9-year-old's casual observation, delivered without agenda, over cereal, already forgotten, lands in his father with the force of a structural report. Adam has been building a mental inventory of anomalies. The changed passcode, the late dinner, the quality of Sera's evening energy, the single initial on a phone screen. None of these is evidence of anything, and yet all of them are consistent with a single explanation he is not yet willing to name. The comparative analysis here is between the Sera of before, depleted after work, present at the kitchen table, part of a shared rhythm, and the Sera of after, charged and alert, and returning from somewhere inside herself that he has not been invited into. This before and after is not dramatic. It is the slow, almost imperceptible shift of a person whose emotional center of gravity has moved. Adam recognizes the charge in her because he has seen it before. It is the energy of early love. The devastating irony is that he recognizes it precisely because it once belonged to him. November arrived cold and gray, and I moved through it with a new and unwelcome kind of attention. I began, without making a conscious decision to do so, researching. Not her, not yet. I began researching the thing itself, online affairs, the psychology of them, the particular mechanism by which a person could develop, through a screen, a level of emotional intimacy that rivaled or exceeded what they shared with the person sleeping beside them. I told myself this was professional curiosity. I was, after all, someone who liked to understand systems before engaging with them. What I found was both illuminating and frightening. Online relationships, I learned, develop with an unusual speed and intensity precisely because they are unencumbered by the mundane friction of physical proximity. There is no bad morning breath. No argument about whose turn it is to call the boiler service. The relationship exists in a curated space, text, images, carefully chosen words, and in that space, both people are always, in some sense, performing their best version of themselves. The intimacy feels real because it is real, emotionally. It simply exists in a context stripped of everything that tests it. I read this and thought of Sera at her desk in the evenings, lit from below by the laptop screen, and the particular alertness she carried back downstairs. The name was Remy. I had been careful not to think about it too directly, but once I started, I couldn't stop. Remy was a name that could belong to a man or a woman, French in origin, not uncommon. It could be a client. It could be a friend I didn't know well. It could be entirely innocent. It could also be the person sending a notification at 8 in the morning that began with no salutation, the way messages begin when they have already established their own language. In the second week of November, I came home early from a site visit that had canceled due to weather. It was a Thursday afternoon, 2:15, the house empty and quiet in the way houses are when you arrive at an unexpected hour. Theo was at school. Sera was, I had assumed, at her desk working. She wasn't home. Her car was gone. This was not in itself unusual. She ran errands, went to the gym, met friends. But she had told me, that morning, that she had a full day of writing ahead. A deadline. She had been specific about it. I sat in the empty kitchen and noted this. I did not call her. I made tea, put on the radio at low volume, and waited. She came home at 4:15, 2 hours before I normally returned. She was surprised to see me. A brief flash of it, quickly managed, before she said something about the weather canceling the site visit and how lucky for me. She smelled of cold air and something warm. Coffee, perhaps, or a room that had been warm before she left it. She did not mention where she had been. I did not ask. What I did instead, that evening after Theo was in bed, was something I am still conflicted about. I looked at our home network router history. I want to be honest about the discomfort of this. There is a version of that action that feels like surveillance, and I am not comfortable with that version. But there is another version. A version in which a person who suspects that the foundations of his life are compromised looks for the kind of evidence that cannot be coached or performed, and that is the version I inhabited. The router history showed device connections, times, and durations. What it showed me, over the preceding 6 weeks, was that Sera's laptop had been connecting to a secondary network in the evenings, a VPN. Not always, but regularly. The VPN masked the destinations of her browsing. Whatever she was doing in the study in the evenings, she had taken steps to ensure it couldn't be traced through the home network. A VPN is not sinister by itself. Writers use them. Journalists use them. Privacy-conscious people use them. But Sera had never used a VPN before July. I sat with the router history and thought about the architecture of concealment, how it is built incrementally, one precaution at a time, each one reasonable in isolation, together forming something unmistakable. There was also, around this time, a secondary thread I had not expected. My closest friend, Dama Chabi, had known Sera and me since before we were married. He was godfather to Theo. He called me in mid-November, ostensibly to arrange a long-overdue dinner. We talked easily for 20 minutes, and then, near the end of the call, he said something that sat oddly. "How's Sera doing?" She seemed, I don't know. I ran into her last month. She seemed preoccupied. I asked where he'd seen her. A pause, brief, but a pause. Coffee shop near the Barbican. She was with someone. I waved, but she didn't see me. Who was she with? I don't know. A man. They seemed absorbed. I didn't want to interrupt. Another pause. I'm sure it was a client thing. I'm sure, I said. We hung up. I put the phone on the table. I thought about Dom, who had been my friend for 15 years and who did not, as a rule, mention things he considered unimportant. He had mentioned this. The chain of cause and effect here is intricate and cumulative. Sera's adoption of a VPN, a single, practical precaution, triggers Adam's router investigation, which in turn confirms that the concealment is deliberate and technically sophisticated. Each discovery raises the threshold of what counts as coincidence. The changed passcode alone was explainable. The changed passcode plus the VPN, plus the client dinner, plus Theo's observation, plus Dom's coffee shop encounter together form a pattern that only deliberate blindness could ignore. Dom's call is particularly significant because it arrives unsolicited. Unlike Caleb's Sandra or Joel's Patrick, Dom does not frame his information as a welfare check. He frames it as gossip, almost. But the pauses in his speech betray the weight he's actually carrying. He, like Claire in Story 2, has made the choice to offer information without forcing confrontation, planting a seed rather than uprooting the garden. Adam receives it the same way, noting, filing, adding to the map. The effect of all these causes is not revelation but pressure, a tightening of the psychological vice that will eventually demand resolution. I want to be careful, in telling this part, not to make myself sound more in control than I was. Because the truth is that by the end of November, I was not sleeping more than 4 or 5 hours a night. I was functioning at work. The methodical, spatial nature of architecture is, in some ways, a gift during a personal crisis, because it gives your hands and your primary attention something to do while the rest of your mind works on a separate problem. But I was hollowed out in a way I hadn't experienced since my father died, and the hollowness had the same quality, the sense of waiting for a shape to fully emerge from the fog. I had a name, Remy, and a description from Dom, a man, absorbed, in a coffee shop near the Barbican. I had a VPN and a changed passcode and a client dinner that ran late, and a Thursday afternoon that was unaccounted for. What I didn't have was anything I could hold up to the light. I thought about what I knew about copywriting clients. Sera worked with a range of companies, mostly mid-sized brands, some startups, the occasional individual. Her client list was something I had a general but not detailed knowledge of. I knew the industries, roughly. I knew the names of a few regulars. I did not know anyone named Remy. In the first week of December, I did something that cost me something. I looked at the email account we used for shared household admin. Not her work account. I didn't have access to that, and wouldn't have looked if I had. But the shared account, where we coordinated family logistics, had occasionally received work-related emails that she'd forwarded to herself. Booking confirmations. Invoice copies. The kind of administrative overspill of a freelance life. There were 2 email threads in the shared account from a sender I didn't recognize. The email address was a personal Gmail. First initial, last name, the standard format. The first initial was R. The emails themselves were administrative on the surface. One was a confirmation of a project scope, the other a payment query. They were professional, correct, but they had been sent at 10:40 at night and 11:15 at night respectively, which are not the hours at which professional emails are typically sent, and the tone, which I read carefully, more than once, had a quality of precision that felt slightly overcalibrated. The way a message feels when it has been written to be read by someone other than its intended recipient. I noted the last name from the email address. I typed it into a professional network search alongside the first initial R and the word creative, which was the industry segment Sera worked in. 3 results. I looked at all 3. The second one had a small profile photo. London-based. Creative director at a branding agency. In his mid-40s. Dark-haired. I stared at his photo for a long time. I felt nothing I could name cleanly. Not rage. Not grief. A cold, focused clarity. The same clarity I feel when I look at a structural diagram and identify the element that is carrying more than it should. This was Remy. I was almost certain. What happened next arrived not from my own investigation, but from a direction I hadn't anticipated, Theo's school. In the second week of December, I attended a parent-teacher evening alone. Sera had a deadline, she said, and we'd agreed I would handle it. Theo's teacher, a composed woman named Mrs. Okafor, was warm about his progress, specific about his strengths. At the end of the meeting, she mentioned, with careful casualness, that Theo had seemed slightly distracted in class the past few weeks. Not disruptively so, just less present than usual. Has anything changed at home? She asked. The standard question, asked gently. I said everything was fine. I drove home thinking about Theo, about what children absorb through the walls of adult life, the atmospheric pressure of things not said, the way a household's emotional temperature changes and children feel it first, in their bodies and their concentration, before anyone has named what's wrong. He had noticed. He didn't know what he'd noticed, but he had felt it. That night, Sera was in the study. I stood outside the door for a moment. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of her typing, and then a pause, and then what I was almost certain was a quiet laugh. The private kind. The kind you make when the room is empty, because you've forgotten the house has other people in it. I went back downstairs. I needed one more thing. Something I could hold. Something that wasn't interpretation or inference, but fact. I thought about the Thursday afternoon in November. The 2 hours she'd been gone when she'd told me she had a full day at her desk. I thought about the Barbican area where Dom had seen her. I thought about the professional network profile with the dark-haired man. I searched for his agency's address. Barbican area. I booked an emergency dental appointment for the following Thursday. A mild toothache I had been ignoring gave me legitimate cover, and I left the office at 1:30. I drove to the street where his agency was located. I parked. I sat in the car with the radio off, and I waited, feeling the particular self-disgust of a man doing something he never imagined he would do. At 2:40, Sera came out of the building. She was with a man, dark-haired, mid-40s. They stood on the pavement for a moment. They were talking. And then, briefly, not dramatically, but without ambiguity, he put his hand against her face, and she turned into it, and he kissed her. I drove home. I drove very carefully, at exactly the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, as if the mechanical correctness of driving could hold the rest of the world in place. The point of no return here is not the kiss. It is Theo's distraction in class. Mrs. Okafor's gentle inquiry is the moment the affair's consequences escape the sealed world of the adults who created them and begin to touch the child who had no part in any of it. This is the structural weight that changes the entire emotional register of the story. It is no longer a matter between Adam and Sera alone. A child is carrying something he cannot name in his body and his concentration, and that fact transforms Adam's investigation from a personal grievance into a parental responsibility. The kiss itself, brief, tender, domestic rather than passionate, is in some ways more devastating than a dramatic display would have been. It is the kiss of familiarity, of an established language between two people. It tells Adam not that this is a reckless attraction, but that it is an intimacy with its own history, its own comfort, its own weight. He drives home at exactly the speed limit. This detail is the story's sharpest psychological portrait. A man holding himself together through the enforcement of small, controllable rules in a world where the large rules have just been broken. I gave myself the weekend. This was a deliberate choice, and I want to explain it. I needed the weekend not to compose myself. I was, on some level, composed already, in the numb, structural way of a man who has been preparing for a blow and has finally received it. I needed the weekend to decide what kind of confrontation I wanted this to be. I had seen, in friends who had been through similar things, what happened when the confrontation was driven purely by emotional shock, the screaming, the cruelty, the things said in white heat that could never be recalled. I did not want that confrontation, not for my sake, for Theo's. Whatever happened between Sera and me, Theo would have to continue living in proximity to both of his parents. So I waited. I was careful and ordinary through the weekend. I helped Theo with a geography project. I made Sunday lunch. I watched television with Sera on Friday evening, as we always did, her feet on my lap, and I felt nothing I could clearly identify. A kind of glass between myself and experience. The world continuing to look normal while the load-bearing wall was gone. On Sunday evening, after Theo was in bed, I went to the kitchen and waited for Sera to come downstairs from the study. She came down at 9:10. She seemed settled, slightly tired. She made chamomile tea, her Sunday ritual, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I need to talk to you," I said. She looked at me. Something happened in her face. A stillness, the way water goes still before a temperature change. She set the mug down. "Okay," she said. I told her what I knew. Not everything, and not in order of discovery. I told it the way a structural report is written. Conclusion first, then evidence. I knew about Remy. I knew she had been to his agency on Thursday. I had been there. I had seen them. She didn't speak for a long time. "How long have you been watching me?" she said finally. "I haven't been watching you," I said. "I've been reading what you left in front of me." This landed. I saw it land. She looked at the table. "How long?" I asked. "Since July," she said. "It started online. We'd worked together briefly, a project, last spring." He followed up. It wasn't supposed to be anything. But it became something." "Yes." "When did it become physical?" A pause. "October. The client dinner. The flush, the bright eyes, the smell of cold air and something warm." "Does he know you're married?" "Yes." "Does he care?" She was quiet for a moment. "He cares," she said carefully. "He has feelings about it." "What about you?" I asked. "Do you have feelings about it?" She looked up. Her eyes were wet. Finally, the first emotion that had broken through the controlled surface. "I didn't go looking for it, Adam. I want you to know that." "That's not what I asked." She pressed her lips together. "Yes," she said. "I have feelings about it." I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help. Are you in love with him?" The silence before she answered was the longest silence of the evening. "I don't know," she said. "I think I might be. I think that's the honest answer." I nodded. I had expected this answer. I had even prepared for it. And yet the preparation had not prevented the feeling. A clean, cold pain, like a cut that doesn't immediately bleed. We talked for 2 hours. The kitchen grew cold. Neither of us moved to adjust the thermostat. At some point I made tea I didn't drink, and she held her chamomile and let it go cold, and we sat in the dim light and worked through the shape of what had happened between us, the shape of what we had allowed ourselves to become over 12 years. The drifting, the routine, the slow compression of intimacy into function. I told her what Theo's teacher had said. This hit her differently than anything else I had said. She put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled. She sat very still. "He doesn't know anything," I said. "But he's feeling it. Children always feel it." She nodded. She couldn't speak for a moment. "I think," I said, "that whatever we decide, about us, about everything, Theo has to come first. Not as an excuse for either of us to stay in something broken, but as the reason we handle this with care." "I agree," she said. Her voice was very small. "I'm going to sleep in the spare room tonight," I said. "And tomorrow we should probably talk about what comes next." I stood up. I pushed in my chair. I stood at the door for a moment and looked at her, at the woman I had built a life with, at the lines of her face that I knew as well as the lines of any building I'd ever drawn, and I felt, alongside the grief, something unexpected. A clarity, a sense of being, for the first time in months, exactly where I actually was. Not where I'd imagined myself to be. This was the truth of things. It was terrible, and it was real, which was better than the alternative. "Good night, Sera," I said. "Good night," she said. I went to the spare room. I lay in the dark and I did not sleep, but for the first time in a long time, the sleeplessness didn't feel like waiting. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't named yet. The confrontation's emotional architecture is built on Adam's deliberate choice to delay, to give himself a weekend, to choose the kind of conversation he wants rather than the kind his emotions might dictate. This is both his greatest strength and a window into the marriage's core problem. He is a man who manages his emotional life through structural control, and that same quality, so admirable in crisis, may have contributed to the drift that created the crisis in the first place. His decision to lead with Theo, to tell Sera what the teacher said, is the confrontation's emotional pivot. Every other revelation she receives with the composure of someone prepared, but Theo reaches past her defenses. This is psychologically precise. Guilt about a spouse can be rationalized, contained, managed. Guilt about a child cannot. The detail that neither of them adjusts the thermostat as the room grows cold is a quiet masterpiece of environmental storytelling. Two people so consumed by the temperature of the conversation that the literal cold goes unnoticed. Adam's final lines, "Good night," "the spare room," "the sleeplessness that feels different," mark the story's true structural shift. He is no longer waiting to understand what is happening. He is beginning to decide what happens next. The divorce took 11 months from that Sunday night in December to final. It was not a cruel divorce, as divorces go. We were both determined, in the way of two people who had once genuinely loved each other, to dismantle things with care. There were difficult days, weeks, even, when the care frayed and we said things from the exhausted, grieving parts of ourselves that we later apologized for. But we came back to the table. We kept Theo at the center of every decision. We hired a mediator rather than adversarial solicitors. We sold the house in April, split it equitably, moved into separate flats on the same side of the city so that Theo's school run, his friendships, his sense of geographic belonging remained intact. I want to tell you about the flat because it matters. I had designed it, not literally, but in the sense that I found it and understood it immediately as the right space. Second floor, south-facing, with a room for Theo that had a window seat where he could lay out his maps. I had stood in that empty flat on a February afternoon and felt something I can only describe as recognition, as if the space had been waiting for me to need it. I painted it myself. Slowly, on weekends when Theo was with Sera, in the particular silence of a space that is becoming yours. Rolling paint on walls and thinking about architecture, about how we build environments to support a certain kind of life, and how the life we build inside them shapes us back in return. Dom came to help with the painting. He arrived with 2 rollers and coffee and said almost nothing for 2 hours, which was exactly what I needed. At some point he said, without preamble, I should have said something sooner. When I saw her at the coffee shop, I told him there was nothing he could have said that would have changed the outcome. Maybe, he said, but you would have been less alone with it. I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. Theo adjusted with the resilience of children who are given honesty proportionate to their age and consistency proportionate to their need. He knew that Mummy and Daddy were not going to live together anymore, that this was not his fault, that he would see both of us often. He cried once, on a Saturday morning, suddenly and without warning. We were making pancakes, and he just sat down on the kitchen floor and cried, the way children cry when the grief finally finds its opening. I sat down with him on the floor and held him and said nothing. And after a few minutes, he asked if we could still do pancakes, and I said yes, and we did. I think about that Saturday often. I think it was the moment I understood most clearly what mattered. Sera and Remy ended things, I learned eventually, around March, several months after everything collapsed. I don't know the details, and I chose not to seek them. It was, apparently, not what either of them had imagined once the imagining had to face the reality of consequences. This is often the shape of these things, I've come to understand. The curated space of an online relationship does not survive transplantation into the full friction of an actual life. I felt something when I heard this. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something more complicated. The sense of a door closing that I had already walked away from. What I want to tell you, what I think is worth saying after everything, is about the design. I have spent my career thinking about the relationship between a space and the life it supports. Good architecture doesn't just house a life. It shapes it, creates conditions for certain kinds of connection, certain kinds of solitude, certain kinds of growth. A badly designed space constrains the life within it without anyone quite understanding why. I think marriages are like this. I think Sera and I had built something that, for the last few years, had been constraining us both. Not maliciously, not deliberately, but through accumulated habit and assumption and the particular laziness of familiarity. We had stopped designing. We had started maintaining. And maintenance, without attention, becomes neglect. I don't say this to excuse what she did. Her choices were hers, and they caused real harm. To me, and, through no fault of his own, to our son. There is an accounting for that which I have made in my own way, and which I will not minimize. But I also know that a structure that fails was not well designed from the start, and the failure belongs to everyone who built it. I am better, now, at designing, at paying attention to what the structure actually needs, rather than what I assume it does. I am better at asking questions before the silence becomes a language of its own. I am better, in the flat with the south-facing rooms and Theo's window seat, at being present in the life I am actually living rather than the one I thought I was managing. It is April as I write this. The magnolia in the courtyard below my window has been in bloom for 2 weeks, and will be for 2 more. I drink my coffee at the kitchen table in the mornings, and I listen to the city waking up, and I feel, most mornings, something that I am not yet calling happiness, but which is in that direction. A provisional okayness, a sense of standing on solid ground. I fix what I could fix. I let go of what I couldn't. I am a man who builds things for a living. I know that sometimes you tear something down not because it has failed entirely, but because the new thing you could build in its place will be better, more honest, more deliberate, more truly suited to the life that needs to live inside it. I am not done building. I am, for the first time in a long time, looking forward to what comes next. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was truly mine. Writing story 3 now, fresh characters, new setting, online to real affair, ending in empowerment. The story, as a whole, is a study in perception versus reality, and how slowly accumulated inconsistencies reshape a person's understanding of their own life. Adam begins with the belief that his marriage is structurally sound, not perfect, but stable. What unfolds is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual reinterpretation of signals he had previously normalized or ignored. The emotional power of the narrative lies in this contrast. The ordinary surface of domestic life against the hidden, parallel reality developing beneath it. Psychologically, Adam's journey is one from control to acceptance. His instinct is to observe, analyze, and delay reaction until he has certainty. This protects him from chaos, but also prolongs his exposure to it. Sera, by contrast, embodies emotional displacement, seeking intensity and validation outside the constraints of a familiar structure, while maintaining the external appearance of stability. Their marriage fails not only because of the affair, but because both partners adapted to disconnection rather than confronting it early. The resolution reframes the story away from betrayal and toward agency. The divorce is not depicted as destruction, but as redesign, an intentional dismantling followed by conscious rebuilding. The flat becomes a symbol of regained authorship. Importantly, the ending avoids false triumph. Instead, it offers provisional okayness, which feels psychologically honest. Ultimately, the story argues that relationships fail not only through dramatic rupture, but through unexamined drift, and that recovery begins the moment reality is faced without distortion.